Venezuela in the early 21st century became one of the world's most dramatic political experiments, a country with vast oil wealth, deep inequality, and a leader who promised to rebuild the nation in the name of the poor. That leader was Hugo Chávez, a former army officer with a gift for turning politics into something emotional, personal, and impossible to ignore. To his supporters, he was proof the forgotten majority could finally run the country. To his critics, he was concentrating power at speed. Either way, daily life began to revolve around the state, from what you could buy to what you were told was true. In this blink, you'll learn how Chávez built power through attention and loyalty, how oil money kept the system running even as it was quietly redirected, and how everyday life began to strain under the weight of corruption, fear, and failing services. To understand how it worked, let's start with the way Chávez used television and public spectacle to run the country. Turn on a Venezuelan TV during Hugo Chávez's presidency, and there was a good chance you'd find him talking directly to you. He treated airtime like a core tool of government, using live broadcasts to announce decisions, set priorities, pressure officials, and keep himself at the center of national life. By the late 2000s, he appeared constantly, often unscripted, shifting from policy to jokes to personal stories without warning. His signature platform was the long-running Sunday program, Hello, President, which could stretch for hours and feel like an entire week of state business compressed into one day. On a Sunday in February 2010, more than a decade after he took office, the show rolled on as if it were the country's command desk. Officials arrived to present updates and receive orders in real time. A mayor spoke about taking over properties around Plaza Bolivar. Live links pulled in scenes from projects across the country, and Chávez moved from big-ticket ideas like railways and roads to intimate moments with family in the studio. Afterward, aides compiled transcripts that could run close to 90 pages, turning a performance into an official record. The interruptions didn't stop with his own program. He could take over every channel, public and private, with a mandatory presidential broadcast known as a cadena, cutting into movies, soap operas, even baseball. Sometimes he spoke for hours. Sometimes viewers were left staring at ceremonial footage and background noise, waiting for the message to return. Away from the cameras, the same urge to control information shaped daily government. Ministries rarely explained themselves, press offices were cut back, and public communication was funneled through a central ministry near the presidential palace. Ministers often looked more like supporting cast members than independent decision-makers, careful not to step outside the leader's message. Inside Miraflores Palace, that centralization had a rhythm. After his 1999 inauguration, Chávez often slept in the palace, rising late after long nights, dressing with care, and heading to an underground situation room where civilian staff and military officers tracked events and planned the day. Breakfast came with stacks of handwritten requests collected from crowds, summarized overnight by clerks in a place tellingly called the Office of Hope. When a country's politics run on attention and obedience, the real test is what happens when insiders stop playing along. In the next section, you'll look at defectors and what it cost to break ranks. Cesar Garcia, a rancher in Barinas, voted for Hugo Chávez in 1999 because the countryside felt ignored. He ran a 1,400-acre farm and wanted someone willing to break the old habits of politics. In the first burst of optimism, Chávez's support briefly reached about 90%. Garcia's doubt didn't arrive in one dramatic moment. It crept in through the radio as he drove between fields. Chávez spoke constantly, and the tone grew more combative, dividing Venezuela into loyalists and enemies. In October 2001, he made land ownership a national fight, attacking huge estates and promising to end the latifundios, the old system of sprawling private landholdings. Garcia listened and started to wonder where he now fit. The sharpest test came in mid-2003. Opponents tried to trigger a recall referendum, a tool written into the new constitution to remove an elected official before their term ended. They collected around 3 million signatures. The Electoral Council ruled the petition flawed and demanded it be done again, with Chávez warning that signers. After that, disagreement became traceable. A digital record of the signers went to Luis Tascón, a young National Assembly member, and he published it online. State offices used the list to fire public employees, deny jobs and contracts, block loans, and delay basic documents. The list later fed into a broader program called My Santa, which could track voting behavior and label citizens as patriots, opposition, or abstainers. Chávez later publicly ordered it buried, but the data kept circulating inside the government. Once the state could sort ordinary citizens by loyalty, the same logic spread upward into the government itself. Careers began to depend less on competence and more on trust, obedience, and proximity to the center of power. In the next section, you'll see how that dynamic hardened into a palace court, where closeness became influence and the rules of the system increasingly bent toward whoever had the president's ear. Once Chávez's opponents weakened, the bigger battles moved inside his own camp, where everyone competed for access to the president's attention and approval. Around him, a palace culture formed, with its own social code. Ambitious officials learned to dress the part, speak the right way, echo the latest slogans, and praise announcements the moment they landed. It wasn't enough to agree with the revolution in public. The real currency was being seen as useful, loyal, and close. A handful of figures turned that closeness into real governing power, none more important than Jorge Giordani, the austere planning minister, nicknamed the Monk. He approached Venezuela like an engineer facing a messy machine, convinced society could be redesigned through controls, targets, and long-range plans that would take decades to complete. That mindset suited Chávez perfectly because it offered something leaders always want: an economy that responds to command. The more the state tried to manage everything from the top, the more politics became a test of discipline. Big decisions narrowed into a small circle, and everyone outside it learned to wait, watch, and stay in line. Success became more about proving you were dependable and never embarrassed the leader. All of this made Chávez stronger, but it also raised the stakes of disloyalty. In December 2007, he suffered an unexpected referendum defeat, blaming Raúl Baduel, a former ally who'd helped undo the April 2002 coup by rallying loyal troops and helping bring Chávez back to Miraflores. Baduel then broke publicly with the president and urged voters to reject the constitutional changes. That gave hesitant supporters permission to abstain or vote no and helped tip a close result. Within a year, he was hit with a $14 million corruption case, jailed, and sentenced to 8 years in the military prison of Ramo Verde. Baduel insisted it was a political takedown, and by that stage, Venezuela's courts were so tightly controlled that outsiders could not know what was true. Chávez responded to setbacks with a simple instinct: rewrite the playing field. After the opposition won key local posts, new laws stripped mayors and governors of real authority. Then, in February 2009, he pushed through a referendum abolishing term limits, winning with 55% and clearing the path to stay in power indefinitely. But how was Chávez paying for all of this? In the next section, you'll see how oil money and the stories built around it helped keep that system running, even as reality began to push back. Venezuela's oil wealth was meant to pay for a new kind of politics, but it also made bad habits easier to hide. When crude prices rose, the government had more money to spend and more ways to spend it quietly. Budgets were sometimes written using cautious oil price assumptions, around $35 a barrel, even as the market surged toward $100. The gap could be diverted into special funds, spent outside the normal budget, and tapped whenever pressure built. That kind of flexibility helped buy loyalty and keep the system moving, but it also blurred the line between public money and private deals. With oil revenue surging, PDVSA, Venezuela's state-owned oil company, controlled huge cash flows that could be redirected quickly, sometimes outside normal oversight. Special funds and off-budget spending made it easier to pay for political priorities at speed, especially during tense moments like elections or crises. The downside was predictable. Decisions became harder to trace, accountability weakened, and corruption could be handled quietly, with scandals more likely to be managed than properly confronted. That habit of protecting their own and shutting down scrutiny mattered even more when real problems arrived. In the winter of 2009 and spring of 2010, an El Niño drought dried the grasslands and drained rivers. The Guri Reservoir, one of the world's largest dams and the backbone of Venezuela's electricity supply, fell to dangerously low levels. Blackouts spread across the country. Engineers pointed to another cause, too: years of neglected maintenance. Of roughly 36 power projects announced since 2002, only 2 had been completed. Chávez responded the way he often did, by talking faster than reality. On February 8, 2010, he jumped onto the radio late at night, declared an emergency, blamed capitalism, and promised dramatic fixes, including proposals for Cuban cloud seeding equipment. It kept attention on his voice, even as the lights kept going out. But what happens when money and storytelling can't cover the cracks anymore? Let's find out next. Venezuela's revolution was presented as a project of moral renewal as much as material change. Chávez wanted citizens who were more educated, more civic-minded, and less shaped by the old culture of corruption and resignation. He launched a national push for ethics and enlightenment, arguing that education and solidarity would replace old habits of corruption and indifference. Literacy programs reached older residents who had never finished school, and expanded public education helped poorer students stay in class and move on to free university places. But daily life was getting more dangerous. Violent crimes surged, and insecurity began to shape routines more than any slogan. Instead of taking ownership, the president often chose silence. Caracas could pass through a weekend with more than 60 dead, and funeral convoys winding through the streets, and the palace offered no plan. Media controls made the crisis easier to downplay. Officials withheld statistics, a newspaper was barred from printing violent images, and a television station was fined for covering a jail riot. The prison system showed what that failure looked like up close. From 1999, reform plans were announced in the language of dignity and humanization. In practice, jails became overcrowded, filthy, and lethal. The population swelled to almost 50,000 people in facilities built for around 12,000, and huge numbers of detainees were held for years without trial. Then came a warning to anyone who still believed the courts could stay independent. On December 10, 2009, Judge Maria Lourdes Afiuni granted bail to Eligio Cedeno, a banker held for almost 3 years without trial on a currency controls case. Prosecutors didn't show up, and Venezuelan law required release after such prolonged detention. Cedeno slipped away and later resurfaced in the United States. Afiuni was a low-profile judge and single mother, but Chávez demanded her prosecution on television, and she was jailed at Los Teques Women's Jail. When prosecutors couldn't prove bribery, they accused her of spiritual corruption, and other judges stayed silent out of fear. Now, in the final section, you'll see how that simmering frustration started spilling into the streets. By the early 2010s, frustration was escalating. Towns protested blackouts, water shortages, unpaid wages, and broken roads. The rights group, Prevea, counted 1,763 demonstrations in 2008 and nearly 4,000 by 2011. Inside the palace, officials tracked flare-ups and braced for the ones that could block transport. Marone showed how little it took to shake the system. 2 motorways crossed the town so a few dozen neighbors could stop traffic and disrupt travel nationwide. The demands stayed concrete: water, electricity, jobs, and clinics that worked. What stands out is how often the government chose to negotiate. Arrests were rare and brief. A harsh crackdown would have clashed with the state's claim to represent the poor, and most protests weren't calling for the president to resign. There were local fights over services, and oil income, plus Chinese loans, still gave the government room to calm trouble with cash or quick fixes. Then, the biggest uncertainty came from the top. In late June 2011, Chavez appeared on a grainy broadcast from Havana and said doctors had removed a pelvic tumor and found cancerous cells. He vanished for stretches, rumors filled the gaps, and politics became a countdown. The opposition held a primary that drew about 3 million voters and chose Henrique Capriles, a 39-year-old centrist governor. But Chavez turned survival into a campaign message. On January 6, 2012, he took over every channel from the shrine of Our Lady of Coromoto. He was visibly swollen and tired, but he insisted he would carry on. Even after disasters like the Amway refinery explosion that killed 42 people, the electoral machine held. In October 2012, he won 8.1 million votes to Capriles' 6.5 million, 55% to 44%, with turnout above 80%. Soon after, he promoted Nicolás Maduro to vice president, pointing to a successor without stepping aside. The Constitution spelled out the handover if illness ended his term, but the country was left waiting for the day politics could no longer be performed on command. The main takeaway of this blink to Comandante by Rory Carroll is that Venezuela's upheaval was driven by the way Hugo Chávez concentrated power through constant public presence, enforced loyalty at every level, and used oil money to keep the system running. As institutions became more personal and less accountable, corruption was easier to hide, dissent became risky, and everyday life began to strain under failing services, rising crime, and pressure on the courts. By the time illness raised the question of succession, the country was left with a powerful political machine, but weakened checks, deeper division, and growing instability baked into the system. Okay. That's it for this blink to Comandante by Rory Carroll. We hope you enjoyed it. If you can, please take the time to leave us a rating. We always appreciate your feedback. See you in the next blink.